Luke 24:13 through 35. It's an old story, comes this time of year, every year. It's about a couple of guys walking from one town to another and talking as they go. But it's an interesting story, and maybe we can take it from some insight that we haven't considered in the past. One day, Marlene Nance's little daughter, Emma, was playing with her paper dolls. These were special paper dolls. They were all Bible characters. Bob, are we recording?
Yes, sir.
Oh. Suddenly, Emma realized that the Jesus paper doll was missing. Marlene and Emma looked all over the house and they couldn't find Jesus anywhere. Later that afternoon, Emma, running to her mother with some good news, she said, "I found Jesus. He was in one of Daddy's magazines." Emma proudly held out her new Jesus, and Marlene gasped as she took the picture from Emma's hands. It was a picture of a tall, bearded, homeless man dressed in rags. Because of his long hair and beard, he resembled Emma's paper doll, Jesus. As Marlene reflected on Jesus' own words about the poor and the powerless, she agreed that her little girl had found Jesus. There's a story that's close to home. Sister Rachel Hosmer tells about a dream she had. Rachel Hosmer was a nun. And I won't tell you all about her, but it is interesting to read about her because she accomplished a lot of things. And in the Catholic Church, becoming a mother in their hierarchy was a big deal. This woman became a mother. But back in 1933, Rachel was a nun in Versailles, Kentucky. And she reopened the Margaret Hall School in Versailles. And in 1934, she became the principal. Isn't that interesting? That a story such as this is just a few miles away. Rachel is telling this story about a dream she had. One night during this dream, she was placing an order in the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Most of us right now remember Sears and Roebuck.
I had the last edition, one of the last editions they made. Haven't even torn the label off.
And I remembered Sears and Roebuck, besides buying something from it, was in the outhouse.
Yeah.
Anyway, Rachel had this dream, and in the dream, she could order about anything. But in the dream, this was no ordinary catalog. She could order Jesus of her choice from this catalog. There was a Jesus as a seminary professor with a pipe and a tweed jacket. There was a Jesus that was a farmer with calluses on his hands and dirt under his fingernails. There was a Jesus from suburban church, this Jesus with his in-fashion attire. There was a Hispanic Jesus, an African-American Jesus, and even there was a feminine Jesus who enabled women to stand up straight. In her dream, Sister Rachel chose one and ordered that Jesus. She received a Jesus, but it was different from the one she ordered. She ordered another Jesus, and again, she got a Jesus different from the one she had chosen. This happened again and again. Every time she received a Jesus who differed from the one she ordered. The message of her dream became clear the next day. If she started where she was with what she really longed for, Jesus would come into her life. And he was always different from her expectations, always wonderful, very surprising. She says, as the voice from the burning bush told Moses, Jesus in her dream would be who he would be. I am who I am. There's a 80-foot maple tree in Milford, Connecticut that hasn't changed much over the years. There are new leaves every spring, of course, and in the autumn, all the leaves fall off. There's a spot where a limb came off when Hurricane Gloria blew through in 1985. Other than that missing branch, which was cleaned up with a chainsaw, the tree on Holly Avenue has looked the same as long as anyone can remember. The spot where the limb was blown off caused quite a stir in the neighborhood some time back. One of the residents, Claudia Voigt, looked at the tree one day and saw what looked like the face of Jesus. She said, it took my breath. I told my friend to come over, and pretty soon the entire neighborhood was looking. Word spread quickly throughout the area, and before anyone realized it, the maple tree became a popular attraction as car after car drove by to see the face of Christ on a tree. Drivers slowed down as they passed by, while others parked and walked through yards to get a first-hand look at this strange apparition. Claudia, the lady who first made this discovery, describes herself as someone who attends church but is not overly religious, whatever that means. She told a reporter, I'm not reading the Bible all the time. The tree for Claudia is some kind of sign, though. I just think people may be able to take some hope from it, she says. Eve Mesra, another Holly Avenue neighbor, brought her 17-year-old son over to touch the tree in hope that it would cure him of seizures that he suffered from. Eve says you never know. Another resident, Kathy Cornwall, says she brought her 3 children over to see the tree. We have a lot of single mothers in the neighborhood, she explained, teenagers who have to make tough decisions in these times. Kathy also sees the face of the tree as a message of hope. She says it's like a message to have faith in ourselves and to have hope for the world. All that brings us to a question. Where in the world do you find Jesus? That question has been asked by every generation. Where do you find Jesus in times of heartache? Where do you find Jesus in times of disappointment, in times of tragedy? The residents at Milford, Connecticut saw what looked like a face on a tree. Some thought it was the face of Jesus, and that somehow this sign from God would work miracle. In recent years, people have seen or have been reporting of seeing Jesus' face on the side of a house, on the side of a barn, on a water tower for a town, among other places. Where do we find Jesus? Even more important, how can we be sure that Jesus is really with us when everything seems to be going wrong? Well, get the picture. What a weekend it was for the followers of Jesus. It seemed as though the bottom had fell out, and their hopes and dreams seemed to vanish when Jesus died on the cross. They were in a state of shock and fear. All their hopes and dreams seemed to vanish when Jesus died on that cross. They were in a state of shock. Everything happened fast. Early on Easter Day, women had reported seeing angels who told them that Jesus had risen. The disciples at first dismissed the women's report. That's just an idle tale. Peter, though, ran to the tomb and discovered it was indeed empty, as the women had said, and he went home, amazed at what had happened. That afternoon, two believers, Cleopas and an unknown companion. Can you imagine being an unknown companion? That don't sound too appealing. You would have thought if Luke wrote this, he would have found out who the unknown companion was and put his name in, but he didn't. But these two were walking a distance of 7 miles from Jerusalem. That's where they were headed toward Emmaus. The walk would have taken 2 to 3 hours, and maybe it would help them put the events of the past weekend into some perspective. Maybe they could make sense out of all of it. On the way, a stranger caught up to them. It was actually the risen Jesus, but they didn't recognize him. He walked with them and asked them what they were talking about. Cleopas replied, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" So, like, you big dummy. The risen Lord asked, "What things are you talking about?" They answered, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people." Question: who found who? Did Cleopas and his friend find Jesus? Or did the hound of heaven find them? Their discouragement and their lack of faith blinded them to the risen Lord who was standing right beside them. What happened when that happens to you? We can be so down that we forget that finding Christ is really not that difficult. We don't have to look on old tree stumps. But where do we look? First of all, we find Jesus in the pages of the Bible. Duh. Have you ever been reading the Bible and come up on a word that seems to have been written just for you at just that time? At such times, we meet the risen Lord. As they continued on their way to Emmaus, Jesus began teaching Cleopas and his companion that what the scriptures said about the Messiah. As he interpreted to them the word, their hearts burned within them, and they began to discover who it was that walked with them. Now, they just didn't say, "Whoa, it's him." But then they started thinking about it. I've heard those words before. I've seen this picture before. And inside of them, they're going, yeah. But it didn't go in the direction of who was saying it to them. A man named Dan Wakefield made the same discovery, same time. Dan grew up going to Sunday school, but he left the church and was away from it for many years until one day he visited the Holy Lands. It was truly a changing experience. He thought how amazing it was that he, Dan Wakefield of Indianapolis, Indiana, was standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The name Galilee was magical to him. It brought to mind the images of Jesus and his disciples, men who really did walk there, who went fishing there. Standing on the shore of Sea of Galilee, he could not help but think of a hymn that went like this, or the name was, I Walked Today Where Jesus Walked. He spent the day fishing with local fishermen in the holy atmosphere of the Sea of Galilee. Dan recalled the stories that he learned from the Bible in Sunday school. But this was a memory that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. You see, memory, images, stories from Sunday school, all stimulated from being in a place where Jesus walked. So the question is, who did this? Did Dan Wakefield do this? Or did Jesus do this? On the road to Emmaus, Jesus taught and interpreted the scriptures to Cleopas and the other believers. They also would remember that special day for the rest of their lives. They found Jesus. They found him, first of all, in the scriptures that he was teaching them or bringing to their memory. But something else happened as Jesus spoke to them. They also remembered the teachings they had heard. Cleopas and his companion had heard Jesus on many occasions. In their state of confusion, they had forgotten what he had already taught them about his suffering, death, and resurrection. They already knew this. There on the road of Emmaus, Jesus jogged their memory just a bit, and all of a sudden, click, they remembered. We also find Jesus when we remember what we have been taught in Sunday school, worship service, by a parent or a trusted friend. A Christian lady in Turin, Italy, writes about waking up in the middle of the night, a strong storm been blowing for 3 days, shaking the pine trees and making them creak. She was in a period in her life where she felt overwhelmed by discontent and disillusionment. She felt that she was about to collapse. She opened the Bible looking for something to comfort her. Some word or words. She first did what she usually does, though. She covered her face with her hand and asked the Lord to be with her. In her mind, she began to sing a hymn that she had learned more than 60 years ago. As she sang the hymn, she remembered being a child with her grandparents up in the mountains. Every evening after dinner, she writes, one of my brothers came with a mandolin and sang several hymns. The hymn she remembered that night went something like this. Sweet, beautiful words of Jesus. They are the only truth. They are light for a heart. The words of this old hymn comforted this lady. They took her pain and bitterness away. In their place, she experienced joy and gratitude. Our faith is strengthened when we remember what we have already learned. The stories, the hymns, the prayers. In them we find Jesus. Cleopas and his companion remembered Jesus' teachings. They certainly felt better now that they did when they were in Jerusalem only hours ago. When they reached their destination, it appeared that the stranger was going further. So they so enjoyed his company that they urged him to stay with them. Bible says urged him strongly to stay with them. Stay with us, they told the stranger, because it's almost evening and the day's nearly over. The risen Lord agreed. It was while they were breaking bread at a table that their eyes were finally opened. They sat down with the stranger to eat. Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Suddenly, they realized this wasn't a stranger at all. This was the risen Jesus. Their eyes were opened, Luke reports, and they recognized him. Jesus broke the bread and their eyes were opened. That sometimes happens to us when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. We perceive Jesus in our midst. Perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps that's how it could be. Perhaps I need to move on before I say something else. Dr. Tom Kroger, like Kroger, recalls a time when he had to be away from his fiancée for over a month to take comprehensive exams for his senior year in college. Being madly in love and having to be away from his fiancée made him very sad. And he was on this bus traveling from Ithaca, New York to New Haven, Connecticut. And the bus stopped in Binghamton at the Binghamton Greyhound station. Station left a lot to be desired. Kroger sat down at a little dinette, one of those with the circular chairs on a pole and a U-shaped counter. And he found himself sitting directly across from an old woman. The old woman saw him. And she said, "Boy, honey, you sure look depressed." Kroger replied, "I am depressed." The woman tried to reach out and pat him on the cheek. He drew back, and she had dirty hands. She was poorly dressed. "What's wrong, honey?" she said. He told her about his fiancée back home and how much he missed her. He showed the woman a picture of her, and the woman said, "Oh, I never saw such a beautiful woman." The woman told him that she'd been married to a traveling salesman who had since passed away. They used to cry, she said, every time her husband had to go away. But how happy they were, though, each time he returned. She told him, she said, "Marriage is wonderful. And you're going to have a wonderful marriage. And everything will be just fine," she said. She suggested that he might feel better if he ate a little something. So she ordered the last donut underneath the scratched up plastic cover that was on the counter. And the woman took the donut and she broke it in two and gave him half of it and said, "Here, eat this." Just then, an announcement came on and the woman said, "That's my bus. I've got to go." And she got up and left. At that time, Dan thought, wow. His eyes were opened. Kroger concluded that I recognized Christ was there in the bus station. In our society today, we're reluctant to interact with those we don't know. Thus, we may miss out on an opportunity to find Jesus just when we need him. Cleopas and his companion had their eyes opened when Jesus broke the bread. Then Jesus just vanished. Immediately they left the place. They didn't walk back. They ran back to Jerusalem in the dark. And they wanted to tell the other believers that they had encountered the risen Christ. We can find Jesus too. Where? Not on a tree with a branch that is broken off, but in the Bible, in the hymns, in the teachings we have heard, and in the Lord's Supper, in the breaking of bread and the drinking from his cup. In our interactions with strangers, it could be said that the hound of heaven is on our trail. Would you recognize him if he caught you? There is a story about an old recluse who lived deep in the mountains of Colorado. When he died, certain relatives came from the city to collect his valuables. Upon arriving, all they saw was an old shack with an outhouse. Inside the shack, next to the fireplace, was an old cooking pot and some mining equipment. A cracked table holding a kerosene lamp and a three-legged chair stood by a tiny window. In the dark corner of the little room was a dilapidated cot with a threadbare bedroll on it. The relatives picked up some of the old relics and started to leave. As they were driving away, an old friend of the recluse on his mule flagged them down. And he asked, "Do you mind if I help myself to what's left of my friend's cabin?" They said, "Go right ahead." After all, they thought, what's inside that shack couldn't be worth anything anyway. The old friend entered the shack. He walked directly over to the table. He reached down under the table and lifted up floorboard. He then proceeded to take out all the gold his friend had discovered over 53 years, enough to build a palace. The recluse died with only his friend knowing how much he truly was worth. As the friend looked out the little window and watched the cloud of dust behind the relative's car disappear, he said, "They should have got to know him better." Someday we'll say that about Jesus. We should have got to know him better. Here today, we're feeding on meaningless scraps where we could have feasted on the bread of life. Jesus is with us. You don't have to find him. You just have to know him. And all God's people said,
Amen. I'm looking out, man. I'm simply saying.